we have the fabulous Leah Hirschfeld with us, and we're going to crack open a whole new controversy. We're just gonna spread the controversy from edge to edge on this show today. So Leah joins us. She's part of a wonderful, I see you laughing at that, but I think it's true, right?
Oh, it's totally true. Totally true.
And Leah's part of a team that at the Center for Autism and Related Disorders that does research. I'm going to let her tell you about that. She joins us on a regular basis along with one of her colleagues, Karen Nolte. But we're glad to have you this week, Leah. And I'm glad that you're here because this is sensitive. So tell us about you and then tell us what we're talking about today.
I love the tee up. So I'm Leah. I'm a research coordinator here at the Center for Autism and Related Disorders, which means I get to spend once a month I come on the show, unless Karen Nolte is coming on, our head of research. And I get to spend my days asking research questions, managing research projects, helping with figuring out the best ways to answer questions that'll hopefully help the communities we serve, which are you, the listeners today, and their families, and also, our clinicians and our funders and everyone like that. So it's pretty lovely. I have a pretty nice job, and I love coming on the show, and I love getting to talk about super sensitive topics. So today, what I'll be discussing, and this is something, Shannon, you had someone email, quite concerned, and I think appropriately so, about this misportrayal of autistic individuals committing crimes more frequently than non-autistic individuals. And it's definitely a misportrayal. I'll start that off. But there's a lot of, if you Google it, if you look at it, the media definitely seems to highly stick to any autistic traits that they can sometimes note. And it's a real misconception. It's a real misportrayal. And the research is really inconsistent. I will say the research mostly tends to show off that autistic individuals are not more likely to commit crimes, and are more likely to be victims, much more likely to be victims. But it is inconsistent. It's not very well researched, and it's not consistently researched. So it's going to be a fun 20 minutes.
And I want everybody. So I had said this at the beginning of the show, but for people who've tuned in, you're going to have thoughts and feelings as we talk about this, and it's okay to have thoughts and feelings. We hope that you'll share them in the chat. We want everybody to maintain civility when you're talking about this, but because it might make you angry. Some of the things that people say and refer to, I'm going to venture you were already angry about it. But I always think that if we shed a flashlight, take the flashlight, shed light on something, we're going to get further in the discussion. So let's wade in. Tell us what the research says.
I love it. So I'm going to talk today. I try to come on and I try to present a research article, and then I try to walk through the research article and kind of both explain what was found so that everyone has access to that article and can use it for their own purposes if necessary. And also so that if you end up reading any research articles, you can also look at it and say, okay, this is how I get this information. This is how I get that information. So today I'm going to talk about an article that came out in 2019, so just a few years ago, by Slaughter and his colleagues at the University of Texas, Houston. And it talks about criminal behavior and school discipline in juvenile justice involved youth with autism, which is quite a mouthful. But if anyone's trying to find this article, this is going to be Slaughter and colleagues, 2019, criminal behavior. And I'll start by first teeing everyone up. This study found that youth with autism committed less property crimes, and also found that youth with autism was not more likely to commit crimes. So they were not more likely to commit crimes, and they were even less likely to commit property crimes than the controls in the article. And the article looked at juvenile justice involved youth, and they looked at records, and I'll kind of walk through the methods there. And they looked at records of individuals with the juvenile justice system with autism, with special education, without special education, and with a learning disability. And I point that out because it's really important to know who the controls are in each study and who they're comparing against. So one of the downfalls, the limitations of this study is that they didn't do controls outside of the juvenile justice system. They have a lovely set of controls inside of the juvenile justice system, which is awesome, but none outside. So that's a limitation, right? But so what Slaughter and his colleagues did.
Just to be clear,
yes.
though, so what we're saying is that everyone who was studied are kids who had already been identified as having an issue in the criminal justice system. So we're not talking about kids that, had never had a run-in with the police. We're not talking about kids on the spectrum who'd never had a run-in with the police. We're not talking about neurotypical kids who never had a run-in. We're just talking about kids who have already been identified, rightly or wrongly, as somebody who's part of the criminal justice system.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you, Shannon. Perfect. Yeah, exactly. And I'll also, I will also hint, Slaughter and his colleagues were also really, not only are there misportrayals in the media, right? That's concerning, but there's also a lot of research to show that students with disabilities are reported to be 1 to 2 times more likely to receive an expulsion or a suspension from school. And if you receive an expulsion or a suspension from school, you're also 3 times more likely to come into contact with juvenile justice services. So if you're already someone with a disability, you're much more likely to have all of these risk factors that associate you, unfortunately, with the juvenile justice system. So this is, again, why this is such an important thing to look at and to really address it and see what's going on.
And I'm just going to pause there for a second and say, we've already talked about this in other areas on the other shows this week, that just yesterday, Bonnie Yates, special education attorney, was talking about the couch to prison pipeline. And on Monday, I was talking on the show about how difficult it is that when kids behave in a certain way, if we don't have a qualifying diagnosis and a way to fight it, the kids get expelled. And we know that that's ridiculous, because if what the kid wanted was to not do the math, now they got the paycheck and they learned all I have to do is pick up the chair and throw it, and I don't have to come to school. And what do we think they're doing when they're at home at school with nothing else to do? We're creating an environment in which they're going to find trouble, or trouble will find them. So not a no-brainer, but pretty evident that this is not the way to do things. Didn't mean to interrupt, but just wanted to reference those other times in the shows this week that we talked about this. So go right ahead.
Interrupt. This is perfect. And I love, honestly, I'll throw all of the research, and then Shannon, you always bring it back and like, so what did you end up saying? I'm like, oh, right. So no, it's perfect. And I'll also, I'll mention too, talking about things that you guys have done this week, or might, audience members might have seen this week. The New York Times just reported an opinion piece about the Indiana Police Department. And the Indiana Police Department had special, I think it was the whole state, had special training to understand teens, just teens, not teens with any special anything, just to understand the developmental needs of teens. Because to Shannon, your point, right? They are not, right now, developmentally, teens are trying to understand how to be individuals. And to some extent, that includes bucking the system and going against, as if anyone's ever raised a teen or known a teen or been a teen themselves, right? And developmentally, they're not at the same place that maybe an adult is, right? And so police officers who received this training had a much better understanding of teens and understanding to de-escalate, to use their words, to repeat and things like that, to repeat their words back to them to make sure the teen knew that they were being listened to. And again, it's an opinion piece. So, but in Indiana, they saw a serious reduction in rates of teens being brought into the justice system. And I think it's so important because they're just teens, not teens with any kind of special diagnosis, not with anything going on, anything unique, other than the fact that they're just teens. And the police department needed special training, and it was mind-boggling, right? So again, it's back to what you were talking about earlier as well, of this perspective taking and understanding, and just understanding what's going on. But anyway, so there's a lot going on here, and it's really important, and there's a lot that everyone's been talking about, I feel like, this week, so this is very timely. So getting back to Slaughter and his colleagues, which is a great last name for this topic. So Slaughter and his colleagues looked at all the criminal case records for all the juveniles in Connecticut from January 2006 to December 2012, so for 6 years. And they included adult records as well, so that they could assess the continuation of offenses into adulthood. And they did have another limitation. They could only identify juveniles with a primary education classification of autism. So if you had a secondary classification of autism, that was off limits for the record keeping. Like the research just didn't have access. So that group was not in the sample. And all of this, a good paper, a good author will write out their limitations and will point out what those were, because they want their science to be replicable and they want their science to be good and important. And they can't say this is totally perfect for everyone if it's not totally perfect for everyone. So they will point that out. If you scroll all the way to the bottom of a research article after the discussion, there will be a part that says limitations as well. So make sure you read it. It's really important because, as you're going through research, you'll be like, this is awesome. This is great. So cool. And then you read it and you're like, right. Take a step back. Some of this is not necessarily generalizable, which is the case here as well, actually. So as they went through the records, they found 143 records of individuals in the juvenile justice system that had a primary educational diagnosis of autism. Most of these individuals were male, 86%, and most of them were white, so about 77%. So this is where, again, this doesn't necessarily generalize. If you have a child who's a girl or not white, this might not necessarily apply. So again, it's important to notice these limitations and to recognize them when it's something like that, when it's not necessarily indicative of everyone. Anyway, the age ranged from 6 to 20 years. The 6 breaks my heart. And the age of first offense also ranged from 6 to 16 years. Again, incredibly young. And about half of the individuals were eligible for free or reduced price lunch at their school, and half of the individuals had a prior offense history. And I just pointed out, just so we understand kind of what those records look like, because that's the population we're looking at. And then Slaughter and his colleagues matched the records of individuals with autism to, again, those controls. Again, these were only individuals that were already in the justice system. So we're not talking about any child who hadn't had some contact with juvenile justice. But so they matched the records of individuals with autism to other juvenile offenders, including individuals without a special education designation, individuals with a special education designation, and individuals with a learning disability. So what did they find? And I hinted this at the beginning. I love to say it at the beginning. So if you have to sign off, you get the takeaways. But they found that just juveniles with autism were less likely to commit property offenses. So those property offenses are vandalism, robbery, burglary compared to the controls. And they found that there were no group differences found for crimes against persons. So, and again, this means that juveniles with autism, with special education, with learning disabilities, without special education, did not differ statistically from one another with regards to crimes against persons, status offenses, drug law violations, or public order offenses. So it means that juvenile justice involved youth with autism were not more likely to commit any kind of offenses, and they were less likely to commit property offenses, and they were actually also less likely to recidivate, so to again offend. Though those differences between the groups were not statistically significant, but I think it's important to mention because it's a good finding. And so, there are again these limitations. No community sample outside of youth-involved juveniles. Majority of the individuals in the study were white. They were also male. So it's hard to generalize to other populations. And the records are official crime data. So police discretion or interactions or crimes that didn't lead to an arrest or arrests that were diverted by the court were also not included in the data. And that's all if you scroll down to the bottom of any research article, like I said, those limitations should be there. The authors have spent a lot of time thinking about the limitations because they also can't get accepted by publications if they say my research is perfect and has no limitations, because everyone's research does. Everyone's does. We try to be as good as we can, and it's not necessarily feasible. So always scroll down to the limitations. Always, it's like a paragraph or two. Always read it. And so the next thing that I have to talk about is kind of how can we help autistic individuals not be victims and not fall into this kind of I'm trying to think of a good word, but
the system.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. Yes, exactly. Yeah. And so several literature and advocacy groups will recommend actually introducing your child to local first responders. I know I was reading on one group that did this, I think in Oregon, and they had autistic individuals come and meet with first responders at the station, and the first responders had a huge, they took away so much, but the kids did too. They loved it. They loved hanging out with the first responders. They loved seeing all of the gadgets and gizmos. I mean, I have a nephew. He's super into police and firefighters. Like they're cool. They're really cool. So it's good for both the child and for the first responders. Try to have a local first responder come to your class to do a presentation or to get to know the local children. You might even have a parent who's already a parent of one of your children who's already in the first responding world, who might also be able to come in or come bring their friends or et cetera. And talk to your clinical supervisor. I always recommend talking to your clinical supervisor candidly about the concerns you may have. Brainstorm together the ways to talk to your child, to that local community provider, and to provide your child with some strategies, like being able to say that they're autistic, being able to say that their name, their home, their phone number, a few other things that might just make sure that they're safe, or as safe as they can be. Unfortunately, in the world that we currently live in, which will hopefully change one day, as Shannon had pointed out, but we have to meet the world as it is. And I'll also mention, there was one study that I was looking at as I was reading through all this literature that had a group of participants as jurors and in a mock trial. And half of the jurors were told that the person on trial had an autism diagnosis, and the other half of the jurors were not. The mock trial just went on and did the thing. And the jurors who were told that the individual had an autism diagnosis were more likely to be understanding to the person and on trial, and were more likely to be kind to that person who was on trial, compared to the jurors who did not know about the diagnosis. I know that's a whole nother conversation about if you want to ever say that your child has autism or not. I'm just giving the information out there. Again, there's a lot that goes into that choice. I don't want to get into that. I'm already tackling this conversation. But it's something to be aware of, that it can potentially also help. I know, again, lots of other things goes with that choice. And then additionally, one other thing that you can talk to your clinical supervisor with is to teach your child assertiveness skills. And I think Karen talked about cyberbullying a few months back, maybe, but talk to your clinical supervisor to teach your child assertiveness skills, so that if they're in a situation that they don't like, they can say, I don't like this. They can say no. They have opportunities and strategies to get out of that situation. That's my soap opera for today, my soapbox.
But it's a pretty big soapbox. And I think it's super important. And I'm glad that you mentioned the part about talking to your clinical supervisor. Because if you are someone who is on the spectrum, or you have a child who is on the spectrum, we all need to make decisions about how we feel about certain things. And I know it's a volatile subject and it's a concerning subject more than ever. But how you feel about first responders, like what is and I'm not trying to tell anybody what they should feel at all, because if your first reaction when the police show up is a feeling of, I don't know if I'm going to be okay, I don't want to invalidate that. But I think we have to make a decision about how we interact with these individuals, and how we teach our kiddos to interact with these individuals. And it's a power-packed, concerning subject, but I can tell you that there are more and more things, for instance, like Be Safe, the movie, which is Emily Island's take on teaching kiddos on the spectrum and teaching law enforcement, and having them come together so that if law enforcement is brought to a scene, that the law enforcement has a little bit better of an idea, and that the kiddos who eventually become teens and become adults have a better idea of what the interaction looks like. Because it's two different communities. Police are taught, X behavior is dangerous. And we can argue about that. We can absolutely argue about that. And we can, say we don't like that. But we have to understand that's where they're coming from. And so I go back to instances like the kiddo that we saw in Arizona that was playing with a string. His mom was in the doctor's office across the street, and he was in the park, and he was playing with a string because that's his sensory thing. And the cop came up and saw that and thought that the kiddo was a drug addict because he's predisposed to see that when somebody is playing with a string because somebody hasn't trained him well enough. And the kiddo, when he said, "What are you doing?" and the kiddo saw the police officer, got concerned and started to run away. And now we have the police officer tackling him on the ground and scraping him up. And because he had a preconceived notion that I should be afraid of this police officer. And it's that thing, I'm not saying you're not wrong. I'm saying that it's important that we decide how do we want the interaction to go. And knowledge is power and training is power. It's not going to solve everything. I'm not trying to put that Band-Aid on things, but I know that it's funny because we just had Twinkle on the show on Monday. Twinkle, this wonderful performer that goes and performs all kinds of places, but also is on the library tour and goes to libraries and performs for kids. We went once to see a magician at the library and took our 4-year-old son, and the magician said something to the kids. Here are all these like 4-year-olds, and we lived in a very ethnically diverse community, and they said to the kids, "What do you do when the police come?" And they all said, "Run and hide."
Oh, geez.
And I went, oh, and understood that I was in a community where this was what the feeling was, and that it was being taught to the 4-year-olds, and my child was being raised in this community. Now, I don't have control over whatever everybody thinks, but I knew in that moment as a mom that that's not the lesson that I wanted my child to learn. But further, I wanted to make sure that the police in our community did not, we're not going to do something to a child who's on the spectrum. Now, I happen to live in the community where Emily Island lived, so I went to go do something at the police department, and I didn't have to because she already had. And the police were very well trained, so I lucked out. But I still had to acclimatize my son, and we made appointments where we would go to the firehouse and we went to the police station. And anytime they had an open house, he would go. And he toured the jail, and he saw all of it and had an understanding of who these people are, what they do, and that if I am behaving a certain way, I have an expectation that they are behaving a certain way, but if they start behaving in another way, I need to very appropriately do certain things in order to stay safe. And it sounds redonkulous because nobody should have to teach that to a 4-year-old. We could crochet that on a pillow, but if you do, you do. And we do. We have to teach the 4-year-olds, and we have to teach our kiddos on the spectrum what and how to react with first responders so that they're not running away from a firefighter, so that they're not running away from a police officer. But on the flip, the other thing that the police taught this to my son, because we had an incident a couple of years before where someone had been portraying a police officer and they were up to all kinds of no good. So at that time, they were teaching all of the kids that if you're interacting with a police officer, that you have the right to ask to see their badge. And that if the badge is heavy, then it's a real police officer. And if it's light, they're a liar. And that person you run from. So, there are lots of lessons, and we're not all going to agree on which lessons we want to front load our kids with, but you got to think of your kids' total safety or your total safety. And again, that thing that we go back to about, you can be right, but are you getting what you want? And what I want more than anything else is for our kids to be safe. I also want them to learn and I want them to grow, but we can't do that if they're not safe. We run out of options. So I'm glad that this study exists because I think it lays groundwork, Leah, that it's, I think too often people will say when something goes wrong, and if they find out that it's somebody on the spectrum, they go, well, that's why it happened. And that's not why it happened. I think if we were to take every single one of those kids that are in the study that this was done on, that were in the criminal justice case, criminal justice system, if we were to go through them like a social worker with a fine-tooth comb, we would find something happened that was not what it should have been for that kiddo, that they didn't have the teacher, they didn't have the support, they had adults around them who abused them. We would find that there was a problem. But it's great that we have a study to hold up and say one of the problems was not autism. Yes, they might have had autism as well, but it's other things. But I do think it's important that we start to get our heads wrapped around that. Kids aren't in the criminal justice system because of something that is their fault. That's not how they come into the criminal justice system. They come into the criminal justice system because somebody has failed them. And as a society, we got to start to work on that. But we can end the conversation with people when they go, well, it's just autism. No, that's not the case.
And I will also say, Slaughter and his team did a really amazing job on the introduction for this paper as well. It points to all of the things you just said, Shannon, as well, about that there's this misportrayal, that generally it's a failure of the system previously, that unfortunately individuals with autism are more likely to be bullied or victimized or not have the resources that they need. Again, they talk about that, they're more likely to be expelled. And if they're expelled, they're more likely to have these instances of juvenile. And they also talk about, unfortunately, the way that our world is set up with the core symptoms of ASD, that there's challenges in social situations, demonstrating atypical reactions to sensory input or exhibiting those repetitive behaviors or interests, like playing with a string, that those may not help individuals with autism if they're in a situation with emergency responders. And the introduction is great to really kind of hammer home all those points and to potentially hand out to someone and say, no, read this article. Like, these are all your misconceptions. And they point that you're wrong. Like, this, don't have these misconceptions. And it's a great article. So, if you need it, if anything like that, reach out to research at centerforautism.com. Also, if you have I always put this plug on, if you have any other topics that you want to talk about, that you want us to come on and talk about, please reach out to research at centerforautism.com. We'll also be able to address that. We come on every month, me or Karen, and we're more than happy to take questions and hopefully answer and address anything, or at least provide some research that anyone can go armed into an IEP meeting or clinical supervisor meeting or into a police station or anything else that might be. So
yeah. And I want to say that it goes both sides of it. So if you're looking at a piece of research and you're like, I don't understand this, I don't get it, you can show it to them and say, can you explain what this actually means? Because I'll read sometimes, I'll go, well, it seems like it says this, but then later on I read and it seems like it says something different. And of course, the headline in the news says something completely different than what it actually says. Too often that happens, right? So there's that. If there's a specific study and you're like, I don't get it, please explain it to me, great. But there's the other side of it too, that I love, when you guys say, what's the research say about X? If there's like fill in the blank, what does the research say about, should I be feeding my child grapes? Do grapes help? And then sometimes we've had the experience where you've come back and said to us, there's no good research on this. And that's helpful.
Unfortunately, I feel like that happens more often than I would like. But a lot of the times we also can say, there's the beginning of research on this. And we can kind of talk about what that looks like in the research field. That's a lot of like case studies, so only one participant, things like that. That usually means, I know we're running out of time. That usually means that research is brand new as well.
There we go. So we thank you so much. Again, research at centerforautism.com. If you guys have questions and want to reach directly out to Leah and her team. Great. We thank you so much for all the time and effort that you put into this. It's super exciting for us to hear these things, even when it's controversial.
Shannon, thank you so much. I love being on the show. I was just thinking when I was coming on, I was like, I don't think I was on last month, and I missed it. I missed it in my heart.
We miss you. So fantastic. Thank you so much for being with us. Thanks for watching Autism Live. If you found anything helpful in this video, please give us a like. In fact, make sure that you smash that subscribe button on YouTube and give us a like on Facebook. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram for important updates. And please download our free podcast wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time. Until then, give your kiddos a hug from me and one for you too. Bye-bye for now. To subscribe, click here. And if you'd like to check out some more of our videos, click here.